The rain pelted down mercilessly on the corrugated metal roof as Lieutenant Zhao Wei hunched over the disassembled radar unit. His fingers, nimble and precise despite the numbing cold of December 23, 1944, traced the crude wiring of the captured Japanese Type 22 radar. Outside their makeshift laboratory in Chongqing, China, American B-29 super fortresses roared overhead, returning from another devastating raid on Japanese positions. The 28-year-old electrical engineer from Shanghai University wiped condensation from his wire-rimmed glasses and leaned closer to the radar's exposed innards. Around him, 4 other engineers from the Chinese Technical Research Group watched intently, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of a single overhead bulb. "There it is," Zhao whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. "This explains everything." In that moment, Lieutenant Zhao realized why the mighty Imperial Japanese forces, once seemingly invincible in the air, had become increasingly vulnerable to Allied bombing raids. The radar unit on the table before them, salvaged from a downed Japanese reconnaissance aircraft near Kunming just 3 days earlier, revealed a critical technological gap that would help reshape the air war in the Pacific. No one in the 14th Air Force headquarters knew that one man's discovery that stormy night would soon reach all the way to Allied command in the Pacific and change their understanding of Japanese defensive capabilities forever. The story of Lieutenant Zhao Wei begins far from the front lines of the great conflict engulfing Asia. Born to a modest family in Hangzhou in 1916, Zhao showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics and electronics from an early age. His father, a teacher at a local school, sacrificed greatly to provide his gifted son with an education. Growing up amid the rice paddies and ancient temples of eastern China, young Zhao spent hours disassembling radios and building simple electrical circuits in a small shed behind his family's home. "My father always told me that knowledge was the only possession that could never be taken from you," Zhao would later recall in his memoirs. "Even as the Japanese bombers flew over our city, he insisted that I continue my studies. He believed China's future depended on men of science." At 17, Zhao earned a scholarship to Shanghai University, where he excelled in electrical engineering. His professors quickly recognized his exceptional talent, especially in radio communications technology. By 1935, as Japan's aggressive expansion in Asia intensified, Zhao had already published 2 papers on radio wave propagation that earned him recognition among China's small but growing scientific community. When full-scale war erupted between China and Japan in 1937, Zhao was completing his graduate studies. The brutal Japanese aerial bombardment of Shanghai forced the university to relocate inland, but Zhao continued his research amid the chaos. After the bombing of his family home killed his parents in 1938, Zhao abandoned his academic career and volunteered for the Chinese National Military Commission's Technical Research Group. "I no longer had the luxury of pursuing knowledge for its own sake," he wrote to his former professor. "Now, my work had to serve a single purpose, helping China survive this onslaught." Initially assigned to communications duties, Zhao's expertise in radio technology soon brought him to the attention of General Cheng Ruisheng, head of the newly formed Technical Intelligence Division. Cheng was building a small team of specialists tasked with analyzing captured Japanese equipment. By 1942, Zhao had become the division's leading expert on Japanese communications technology, working closely with American technical advisors from the Flying Tigers and later the 14th Air Force. He had no idea that his expertise would soon be all that stood between life and annihilation for countless Allied aircrews. The Second Sino-Japanese War had been raging for more than 7 years by 1944. Japan had occupied much of eastern China, pushing Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government deep into the southwestern interior to the wartime capital of Chongqing. From there, a desperate resistance continued against the technologically superior Japanese forces. The entry of the United States into the war following Pearl Harbor had brought new hope and resources to China's struggle. American aircraft, supplies, and technical assistance flowed over the treacherous hump route across the Himalayas from bases in India. The 14th Air Force, commanded by the legendary General Claire Chennault, had established a growing presence in China, conducting bombing raids against Japanese positions throughout the occupied territories. But the air war remained a brutal contest. Japanese fighter planes, particularly the nimble Mitsubishi Zero, still posed a deadly threat to Allied bombers. More worrying to American commanders was Japan's growing radar capability, which intelligence reports suggested was improving rapidly. In the fall of 1944, American B-29 bombers operating from bases near Chengdu began striking targets on the Japanese home islands. These missions, part of Operation Matterhorn, represented a major strategic escalation, yet many aircraft failed to return, shot down by Japanese interceptors that seemed to know precisely when and where the bombers would appear. The Japanese are somehow tracking our approach, Colonel James Thompson of the 20th Bomber Command reported in October 1944. "We're losing too many good men and machines. Either they have spotters everywhere, or their radar is better than our intelligence suggests." The Americans desperately needed to understand what they were facing, but captured Japanese radar systems were exceedingly rare. The Imperial Japanese forces typically destroyed their equipment, rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The few specimens recovered were often damaged beyond analysis. All that changed on December 20, 1944, when Chinese guerrillas operating near Kunming reported downing a Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-46 Dyna reconnaissance aircraft. The plane had crash-landed in a rice paddy with its radar system largely intact. Within hours, Zhao and his team had been dispatched to recover the equipment before Japanese forces could reach the crash site. "We traveled for 16 hours straight over mountain roads in the pouring rain," recalled Sergeant Lin Baiyu, one of Zhao's team members. Lieutenant Zhao never rested. He kept saying this could be the key to understanding why our Allied friends were being shot down so frequently. When they reached the crash site, they found local villagers already stripping the aircraft of anything useful. Working through the night, Zhao's team carefully extracted the radar unit, a Type 22 model that intelligence reports had identified as Japan's newest airborne radar system. They transported it back to their laboratory in Chongqing, maintaining absolute secrecy about their discovery. For 3 days straight, Zhao and his team worked to understand the Japanese radar. They meticulously disassembled it, documented every component, and compared it to the technical specifications of American and British systems they had studied. What they discovered would profoundly impact the air war strategy. The historical context surrounding Lieutenant Zhao's work was complex and multifaceted. By late 1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had begun to turn against Imperial Japan. American forces were advancing across the Pacific Islands, while bombing raids on the Japanese home islands intensified. In China, the situation remained desperate but hopeful, as Allied support strengthened the Chinese resistance. The technological race in radar development had become a critical factor in the war. The United States and Great Britain had made enormous strides in radar technology since the war's beginning. Their systems operated at higher frequencies, offered better resolution, and were integrated into sophisticated command and control networks that could effectively direct fighter interceptors. Japan, despite its early advances in electronic technology, had fallen behind. The Japanese military had been slow to recognize radar's importance, beginning serious development only after war broke out. When they did begin investing in radar, their effort was hampered by poor coordination between the Army and Navy, each pursuing separate and often duplicate programs. Additionally, Japan suffered from a critical shortage of electronic components and skilled engineers. Many radar experts had been drafted into combat roles, throwing valuable technical talent into the meat grinder of frontline service. As one Japanese naval officer would later lament, "We sent our best minds to die with rifles in their hands when they should have been in laboratories with soldering irons." By 1944, Japan had deployed several radar systems, including the land-based Tachi series and the shipborne and airborne Type 21 and 22 radars. These operated primarily in the meter wavelength band, while Allied systems had advanced to using microwave frequencies with dramatically improved performance. The Japanese technical shortcomings were compounded by organizational failures. Even when Japanese radar detected incoming aircraft, the information often failed to reach fighter units in time for effective interception. This command and control gap proved as damaging as the technical limitations of the equipment itself. Into this technological battlefield stepped Lieutenant Zhao and his small team of Chinese engineers. As the storm raged outside their laboratory on that December night, Zhao's methodical examination of the Type 22 radar revealed critical weaknesses. First, the Japanese system operated at a much lower frequency than contemporary American designs, resulting in poorer resolution and range accuracy. Second, its vacuum tube technology was outdated, limiting power output and reliability. Third, and perhaps most significantly, it lacked effective countermeasures against electronic jamming. The Japanese have built their radar with 1936 technology, Zhao explained to his colleagues as they huddled around the disassembled unit. The Americans are using 1944 technology. This gap explains why Allied bombers are increasingly able to penetrate Japanese airspace. But there was more. As Zhao traced the radar's signal processing circuitry, he discovered something even more significant. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a particular component. "Their filter design can only distinguish aircraft by range and bearing, not by altitude. That's why high-flying bombers are so hard for them to track accurately." The implications were immediate and profound. If Japanese radar systems struggled to determine the altitude of incoming aircraft accurately, it explained why high-altitude bombing raids had become increasingly successful despite Japan's radar coverage. The limitations of Japanese radar meant that fighter interceptors were often directed to the wrong altitude, missing the bombers entirely. Saiso worked through the night documenting every aspect of the captured radar. By morning, he had compiled a detailed technical report and prepared recommendations for exploiting the weaknesses he'd identified. His findings needed to reach American commanders immediately. Colonel David Rogers, the American liaison officer to the Chinese Technical Research Group, reviewed Zhao's report with growing excitement. "This is exactly the intelligence breakthrough we've been waiting for," he told Zhao. "If your analysis is correct, we can adjust our bombing strategy to maximize these weaknesses." Within days, Zhao's report had been transmitted to 14th Air Force Headquarters and forwarded to the 20th Bomber Command. Accompanied by detailed technical drawings and performance specifications, the report provided Allied planners with unprecedented insight into Japanese radar capabilities. Major General Curtis LeMay, who had recently taken command of the B-29 operations, received the report in January 1945. LeMay was already considering a major shift in bombing tactics, moving from high-altitude precision bombing to lower-altitude night incendiary raids. Zhao's intelligence reinforced his thinking, confirming that Japanese radar and air defense networks had specific exploitable vulnerabilities. "The Chinese engineers' report confirms what we've suspected," LeMay noted in his command diary. "Their radar technology is at least 3 years behind ours, and their integration of radar with interceptor control is rudimentary at best." Zhao's discovery had implications beyond merely understanding Japanese radar limitations. It revealed a critical vulnerability that could be exploited through electronic countermeasures. American engineers quickly developed jamming techniques specifically tailored to the frequencies and filtering characteristics of Japanese radar systems. These countermeasures, deployed on bomber aircraft in early 1945, further reduced the effectiveness of Japanese air defenses. The rising pressure felt by Lieutenant Zhao intensified as the implications of his findings became clear. The captured radar had revealed not just technical inferiority, but a systemic failure in Japanese electronic warfare capabilities. The gap wasn't simply about component quality or design. It reflected fundamental weaknesses in Japan's scientific and industrial infrastructure. Japanese engineers, as Zhao discovered through examination of their radar design, were poorly trained in antenna theory. Crucial to effective radar performance, the physicists who understood wave propagation theory lacked practical electronics experience. This disconnect between theoretical knowledge and practical application had resulted in radar systems that, while functional, were far less capable than their Allied counterparts. Their engineers understood the basic principles. Zhao explained to an American technical team that visited his laboratory in January 1945. But they failed to solve the integration problems that make modern radar truly effective. The components work individually, but they haven't mastered making them work together as a system. The Americans were particularly interested in the Japanese radar's vulnerability to electronic countermeasures. Allied bombers had been deploying chaff, strips of aluminum foil dropped from aircraft to create false radar returns, against German radar since mid-1943. Zhao's analysis revealed that Japanese radar would be even more susceptible to such countermeasures due to its primitive signal processing. Their filter circuits cannot distinguish between genuine aircraft returns and deliberate interference, Zhao pointed out. A simple modification to existing chaff dispensers would make them optimally effective against these Japanese systems. As the technical assessment continued, Zhao and his team made another critical discovery. The command and control systems used to communicate radar information to Japanese fighter units were woefully inadequate. Even when Japanese radar operators detected incoming bombers, the process of relaying that information to interceptor aircraft was slow and often inaccurate. They lack an integrated air defense network, Zhao noted. Each radar operates almost independently, with information passed through a cumbersome chain of command. By the time fighter pilots receive intercept coordinates, the bombers have moved miles from their reported position. This finding explained the Japanese defenders' increasing difficulty in mounting effective interceptor attacks against American bomber formations. It wasn't just that they couldn't see the bombers clearly. They couldn't react quickly enough, even when they did. By February 1945, Zhao's analysis had been incorporated into Allied bombing strategy. American planners adjusted their tactics to exploit the weaknesses he had identified, with devastating results for Japan's air defense network. The B-29 raids on Japanese cities intensified, flying at altitudes where Japanese radar struggled to track them accurately, and deploying tailored electronic countermeasures, the bombers inflicted unprecedented destruction. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 and 10, 1945, demonstrated the new reality. Japanese air defenses had become increasingly ineffective against the technological superiority of American air power. As news of successful bombing raids reached Chongqing, Lieutenant Zhao felt a complex mix of pride and solemn responsibility. His technical insights were helping to shorten the war, but at a terrible cost to the Japanese civilian population. As an engineer, he understood the moral complexity of his role in modern warfare, where technical analysis conducted in a quiet laboratory could translate into destruction on an unimaginable scale. "I do not celebrate the suffering of Japanese civilians," he wrote in his private journal. "I work only for the day when all people in Asia can live without fear of bombs falling from the sky. If my work helps bring that day closer, perhaps it serves a greater purpose than I can fully comprehend." In March 1945, American intelligence officers approached Zhao with a new assignment. The Americans were planning the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands and needed to understand what radar defenses they would face. They requested that Zhao compile a comprehensive assessment of all known Japanese radar systems and predict what developments might occur in the months ahead. Working with newly captured documents and equipment, Zhao produced a detailed report that accurately forecasted Japan's radar capabilities through the summer of 1945. His analysis correctly identified that Japanese radar development would continue to lag behind Allied systems due to fundamental material and expertise shortages. Even if Japanese engineers recognize their technical deficiencies, they lack the industrial capacity and electronic components to close the gap, he concluded. The technological advantage enjoyed by Allied forces will only increase as the war continues. This prediction proved prescient. As American bombers ranged freely over Japanese cities in the war's final months, Japanese air defenses proved increasingly ineffective. The radar gap identified by Zhao had become an insurmountable advantage for Allied air forces. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, bringing the war to its cataclysmic conclusion, Lieutenant Zhao was still working in his Chongqing laboratory, analyzing a newly captured Japanese radar variant. The sudden end of the conflict left him, like many technical specialists, facing an uncertain future in a China soon to be consumed by civil war. In the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, Lieutenant Zhao's contribution to the Allied victory received little public recognition. The secretive nature of his work and the rapidly shifting political situation in China meant that his achievements remained largely classified. As tensions between the nationalists and communists escalated toward civil war, many technical experts like Zhao were forced to choose sides or flee the country altogether. Zhao initially remained with the nationalist government, continuing his work with their technical research division. But as the civil war intensified and the communist forces gained ground, he became increasingly disillusioned with the corruption and inefficiency he witnessed within the nationalist regime. In 1948, as communist forces approached Shanghai, Zhao made the difficult decision to leave China. Using his connections with American technical officers, he secured passage to the United States, where he was quietly recruited by the newly formed U.S. Air Force to continue his work on radar technology. "I left China with nothing but my knowledge and a few technical notebooks," he later recalled. "Everything else, my home, my family history, my country, was lost to the war and revolution." In America, Zhao's expertise in analyzing adversary radar systems proved valuable during the early Cold War. Working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, he helped develop electronic countermeasures against Soviet radar systems, many of which had been based on captured Japanese and German technology. His colleagues noted that he brought a unique perspective to this work, combining deep technical knowledge with an understanding of how cultural and organizational factors influenced technological development. This holistic approach, unusual among Western engineers of the time, made his analyses particularly insightful. Zhao understood that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum, noted Dr. Harold Winters, who worked with him in the 1950s. He taught us to look beyond the circuit diagrams and consider the educational system, industrial base, and organizational structure that produced them. This approach revolutionized how we assessed Soviet electronic capabilities. Throughout his career in America, Zhao maintained a modest lifestyle and rarely spoke of his wartime work. When the classified details of his contributions were finally declassified in the 1970s, he declined most interview requests, preferring to let his technical papers speak for themselves. In one rare interview granted to the Journal of Electronic Defense in 1976, Zhao reflected on the technological gap he had discovered 3 decades earlier. "The Japanese failure in radar development wasn't primarily technical," he explained. "Their engineers were capable, and they understood the basic principles. Their failure was organizational and cultural, the rivalry between services, the hierarchical structure that discouraged innovation, and the educational system that separated theoretical knowledge from practical application. These factors created a fatal gap that all their courage and sacrifice couldn't overcome." This assessment echoed through subsequent analyses of technological development in warfare. Military historians studying the Pacific War increasingly recognized that Japan's defeat wasn't simply a matter of industrial capacity or resource limitations. It reflected fundamental weaknesses in how Japanese military organizations developed and deployed new technologies. The radar gap identified by Lieutenant Zhao Wei in that rain-soaked Chongqing laboratory came to symbolize a broader technological gap that helped determine the war's outcome. His discovery, made possible by the careful analysis of a single captured radar unit, had revealed not just technical specifications, but a window into the organizational and cultural factors that shaped Japan's wartime technological development. By 1945, the technological balance had shifted decisively. American bombers, guided by advanced navigation radar and protected by electronic countermeasures, specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses Zhao had identified, ranged freely over Japanese territory. The defensive systems that Japanese engineers had labored to create proved increasingly ineffective against this technological onslaught. In the decades following the war, radar technology continued its rapid evolution, becoming an essential element of both military and civilian systems worldwide. The principles identified during wartime research, the importance of higher frequencies, signal processing, and integrated command networks, shaped the development of modern electronic systems. Lieutenant Zhao Wei's story illustrates how a single individual's technical insight, arrived at through meticulous analysis and a willingness to look beyond the obvious can influence the course of history. His discovery of why Allied bombers always got through Japanese radar defenses didn't just explain past events. It helped shape the strategy that brought the Pacific War to its conclusion. As we reflect on this history, we might consider a question that Zhao himself posed in his final technical paper before his death in 1984. In warfare between technological societies, is victory determined more by the quality of our machines or by how effectively we organize human knowledge to create and employ those machines? The answer, as his own work demonstrated, is that technology alone is never sufficient. It is the integration of technology with human organization, education, and culture that ultimately determines success or failure in modern warfare. Would you have recognized the significance of those crude radar components on that rainy night in Chongqing? Would you have seen beyond the technical specifications to understand the organizational failures they represented? Comment below and share this story, so others remember what courage and technical insight truly means.